being recorded.
Welcome everyone to the April 15th OpenJ9 community call. As people are still joining, I'll take my time to run through the opening to give everybody a chance to join before Babneet starts with his lightning talk for this week. So just a reminder to everyone to add your name and affiliation to the list of attendees so we know who's been joining the call. And so I'll pause here for a minute like we always do, just to give everybody a chance to ask any questions, particularly community-related questions. All right, then I guess Babneet, if you're It always takes a minute to figure out where the sharing is.
Yep.
Right now I can see your speaker's notes. I'm not sure if that's the window you meant to share.
Yep. So can everyone see the proper slides now?
Yes.
And I'm guessing everyone can hear me properly as well. So good morning. My name is Babneet Singh, and I'm an OpenJ9 contributor. I worked on adding JEP 370 support in OpenJ9. And today we will look into JEP 370, which introduces the Foreign Memory Access API. So if you want to use the API, then you need to have at least JDK 14, and you also need to include the jdk.incubator.foreign module in your application. So let's begin with the goals and activities for the new API. The main objective of JEP 370 is to introduce an API to access all kinds of foreign memory. On this slide, I've listed the three properties that the API designers wanted to enforce. The first is generality. The API should work with all kinds of foreign memory. The second is safety. The API should not crash the JVM while accessing memory. And the last is determinism. The API should not depend on the garbage collector for allocations and deallocations. These operations need to be explicit in the code. So this summarizes the goals and properties of the new API. There are existing alternatives to access foreign memory. So the new API doesn't introduce any new functionality. There are three alternatives listed here: byte buffer, and JNI. Along with their flaws, byte buffer lets you allocate memory off heap, but it is limited to 2 GB allocations due to the int-based indexing scheme it uses. It also relies upon the garbage collector to free the memory, and thus loses the deterministic property. The unsafe API, on the other hand, also lets you allocate memory off heap, but it is the most effective alternative since its memory operations are defined as JVM intrinsics and thus can be optimized by the JET, but it is an unsupported Java API, and it also lacks safety since it can crash the JVM by accessing bad memory. Lastly, you can also use JNI to access foreign memory, but I don't think anyone uses it or should use it because of the complicated development lifecycle and the known costs associated for transitioning from VM to JNI space and vice versa. So this summarizes existing alternatives. So what are the motives behind introducing the new foreign memory API? So first, the API allows memory to be shared across multiple JVM processes. So it forms the foundation for developing native interoperation support, which is the goal of Project Panama. So in simple words, it means we want to make it easier for Java users native libraries. So this is the first motive. Moving on to the second motive, the existing alternatives have flaws as we noticed in the previous slide. Instead of fixing those flaws, the new API will act as a replacement for them. And the last motive is to handle foreign memory in the JVM through one source, which is going to be the new API. And this will remove dependence on external libraries to access foreign memory. And this concludes the motives. And let's look at the main components of the new foreign memory API. The API has three main abstractions: memory address, and MemoryLayout. These are all names of the classes in the new API. Moving forward, we will look into how these classes function through examples. The first abstraction is segment, which represents a continuous version of memory. We can conceptually relate it to the memory returned by malloc or any other native memory allocation function. So here is an example of using MemorySegment. It's a static named allocate native, which allocates memory of the provided size in bytes. In this example, memory of 100 bytes is being allocated. Another thing to note here is the try block. It introduces safety by enforcing temporal bounds, which means memory is automatically freed as the code escapes the scope of the try block. And MemorySegment also implements the safety features for the API. An exception is thrown if MemorySegment is accessed outside the try block. And also an exception is thrown if memory outside the start and end bounds of the segment are accessed. This way, the API protects against both temporal and spatial bounds. Here is another example where we try to access an existing memory segment through the acquire. It implies that memory segment can only be accessed by one thread at a time. It also implies that all threads need to release the segment before it can be freed. So a question which is raised over here is, how do you allow multiple threads to simultaneously access a memory segment? And this can be done through the MemorySegment class, which allows a segment to be divided into smaller memory segments. And multiple threads can simultaneously work on the smaller memory segments, which are derived from the large memory segment. This way, the multi-thread workload can be resolved. So now we move on to memory address, which is the second main component of the API. Conceptually, it represents an address for a memory location. In the scope of the new API, memory address represents an offset within a memory address represents an offset within a memory segment, which also means that you need a memory segment to derive a memory address. Here is an example of memory address where the memory address is being derived from the memory segment. Memory segment has two methods, base address and add offset. A combination of these two methods will allow us to derive a memory address for accessing any byte of memory in the memory segment. And now we move to the last main of the new API, which is MemoryLayout. The purpose of MemoryLayout is to define the structure of data stored in the memory segment. Here I have shown a 10-element array of a struct which consists of two integers, id and val. At the end, I've shown how this array looks in memory. So let's look at how to use MemoryLayout in order to access the elements of the array. when stored in a memory segment. So in this code, we are just defining the struct with two integers, id and val. The struct is defined through a static method named offstruct, which is available in the MemoryLayout class. And at the end, we get an instance of group_layout, which is a derived class of MemoryLayout, and it represents the struct datum, which was seen in the previous slide. And the step is to define the 10-element array. To define an array, the MemoryLayout class has a static method named offSequence. It takes two input parameters. The first is the number of elements in the sequence, or the array, which is 10 in this case. And the second input parameter is the data representation for an sequence element, which in this case is going to be the group layout, which was defined in the previous slide. And it returns an instance of sequence, which is again a derived class of MemoryLayout. The sequence layout instance here represents the 10-element array, which was shown 2 slides ago. So using the combination of offstruct, offSequence, and other methods, other similar methods in MemoryLayout, we can define how data is structured in memory. So once we have defined how data is structured in memory, the last step is to access the data in memory. This is done through var handles. For those who don't know what a var handle is, in short, it is a typed reference to a variable, and it provides an interface to read or write the variable which it represents. So let's look at an example of accessing data in memory through this API. First, we get the var handle from the MemoryLayout instance through the instance method named var handle. In this example, the var handle represents or provides access to all the ID fields in the 10-element array, which is going to be ID_1, ID_2, all the way to ID_10. And then the example depicts the get and set operations using the var handle, which read and write to memory respectively. So this way, var handles can be retrieved from the MemoryLayout instances in order to read or modify structured data in memory. So I think this concludes the basic functionality of the new foreign memory API. So before concluding, I would like to briefly discuss the OpenJ9 work, which was required to support JEP 370. So the new foreign memory API relies upon var handles and method handles, and OpenJ9 has an independent implementation for var handles and method handles. So most of the work went into implementing missing components, identifying missing components, or rewriting existing components for the OpenJ9 var handles and method handles. And at the end, we were successfully able to support the new foreign memory API without any major modifications. So now this concludes, we have reached the end of the presentation. I hope everyone now at least has a simple understanding of JEP 370. Thank you for listening, and back to the host, who I think is Dan Hedinger.
Thanks, Babneet. Just pause for a minute here and see if there's any questions that people have.
General question for me: how does alignment handle?
I think I couldn't hear the question. Can you?
My question was just how is alignment handled, since memory allocations may need to be aligned for accessing foreign memory, depending on the target.
Actually, I don't know the answer to that question, because I know it uses unsafe at the end to allocate memory, but so it will depend upon how the unsafe API works in terms of alignment.
So, Babneet, I have a similar question, but slightly different. I was wondering, you created the structure, and then it stamps it out one after another in memory. Does that mean that if there's any tail padding in that structure, you would have to specify that? Or any padding at all in that structure that has to be defined at the Java level?
Yep, you would have to define all the data in the memory in order to access it. Or I think you would I think end up having two segments. One would be the array, and the segment for the padding will be separate.
If you can bring up your slide where you showed how the segment was created, or how the array segment was created.
Yep.
If you don't mind sharing again.
Yep. Can you see the slides?
Yes. So if instead of being an int val, it was a byte val, and we had a struct of, an int and a byte.
Correct.
Would we have to specify the other 4 bytes of padding that you would typically get with the struct if you were dealing with it in C? Sorry, other 3 bytes of padding?
I think when we define the struct using a group layout, we can generally specify the type of the field in the struct. And so I'm actually not sure if is there going to be any padding or how byte is going to be handled by this API. Maybe I can look into it in more detail and answer your question at a later point.
Okay.
Cool.
The original doc states that all padding is explicit. So if you don't specify the padding in the layout, it's not going to be there.
Cool.
Thanks, Toby. That was my assumption as well. Okay. Any other questions for Babneet? Okay. Much then, Babneet, and we will jump back to the regular agenda then. Pull the agenda up. So thank you, Babneet. Next week we have Keith signed up to give a lightning talk on some of the changes around the debug symbol support that's been added to our builds and our packages at Adopt. Just going to take a quick look at the recent user raised issues, as we usually do. I see that Teresa has raised an issue around verbose module not being supported, and I know there's been some questions for clarifications there. There's a feature request around printing identity hash code. And then the others in here date back to prior to the last meeting. So is there any of these that people want to call out or have a discussion on? Okay. We'll jump back to the agenda. Andrew, have you had a chance to update the graphs?
So I have. This is using the old method. You know the spike that I think there was a network glitch when the stats were pulled. Again, as I say, this is still using the version 2 APIs, which is probably missing a number of downloads, but at least it gives us a consistent trend. And you can see actually the trends from where the spike is continuing. And the OpenJ9 trend has actually gone up slightly in the middle. And in terms of the work that we're doing on getting the trends into the Adopt dashboard, that is making a bit more progress now. There were some tricky bits of design to get that to work, so I'm hopeful in the next week or two we might have something to show there, so we can then be consistent.
That's it. Thanks, Andrew. Does anyone have any questions around the stats? then we'll move down to the release. The 020 release, I know we've been working on getting the builds out as the tags have been pushed, at least for 8 and 11. Have the official tags been pushed for 14?
Yes, they have in the last hour. We've got a merge conflict merging to staging though, which I've just started to look at.
For the 8 and the 11 builds, the tags have been pushed then, and I assume we've kicked the builds. Have they completed yet?
So they're in acceptance test stage for the 020 release at Eclipse at the moment. Assuming that goes well, we'll get the OpenJ9 020 tag and kick off the builds at the top.
Excellent. Is there anything anyone needs to help move this progress or this process forward, or is there any blockers here?
The merge conflict.
Depending on what I find on the merge conflict, it'll either be easy or hard. Might need some help in that. Apart from that.
Can I help you there, Simon? I'll have a look as well.
So at OpenJ9, we ran the JDK 11 release testing, and it mostly completed. We had a lot of problems downloading from Artifactory. So I'm running a couple of tests that didn't run in grinders, and the JDK 8 testing was started this morning, and it's chugging along.
Okay.
And by the time I think that we launch the OpenJ9 builds that adopt, the hotspot pipelines will be completed. I've put links in there under the adopt update to the pipelines. So we won't have to wait. That's what I'm thinking.
Sounds good. Thanks everyone for the focus and effort going into getting this release out. Let's keep it up and push it through. As soon as we get it completed, we'll get it announced on Slack, and I'll try and get it posted through the Twitter handle as well. In terms of upcoming releases, as we close out the 020 final builds now, we have 021 coming up, targeted to July. So I've updated the code split and milestone dates and the expected GA dates for everyone to be aware of. As we look at focus areas for the next little bit, continue to ask that all contributors and committers focus on closing out the issues that we had to move out of the 020 release and into the 021 release, and focus on everything in that 021 release with priority to user-raised issues and seg faults. Trying to get to a point where we've closed out some of these issues that we've been dragging forward for a while. If the link to the milestone plan is here, so it should be easy to find. And if you're running into any issues or concerns around that, please reach out, and I'm happy to help resolve any of those. In terms of the adopt general update, Shelley, do you want to take that?
Sure. I think most things have really been covered. Release week is underway. I'll add the links to the other pipelines for the OpenJ9 pipelines when they've been launched. There's already a retrospective issue that Stuart opened for this release. So if you're helping with the release and you hit issues or want to see something improved, please throw it in that issue as you experience them, so that we can address it next time. That this release, as everyone may know already, will include the early access for the OpenJ9 AR64 builds, and I've put a link to that item as well, just that captures it. And I guess, as mentioned last week, the plan is to actually finish this release and then do a dot release to provide notarized JDK 8 Mac builds. So that work is already done, but we will wait until this release completes before we release those changes. And I understand that we'll also have an OpenJ9 one for that, which is great. And then finally, we're waiting on release week to complete before delivering some additional changes to support smart parallel testing. Some of you might have seen some initial tests of that internally, hoping for next week that we'll be able to roll out some early open examples of that. The implication there is that we'll be able to reduce the time it takes to run an OpenJ9 PR test build by quite a lot. But we'll talk about the details of it next week, I think. That's it. If other people have anything else to add, please do.
Okay. Thanks, Shelley. Just based on what you were saying, I added a 020 retrospective item that we can go through next week after we've completed the builds here as well.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Adam or Joe, is there any update on the infrastructure?
Machines are disabled.
Adam, you're really hard to hear.
Is this better?
Slightly, but still very quiet.
The old AX machines have been disabled for about a week, and they're waiting to give them back once the release is done, just in case we have problems. That's the only update from machine side. For Artifactory, we're pretty much leveled off for usage. Investigated that I know that all the builds are using the same storage, so I opened a PR to have the storage numbers match the build number. So that should reduce our usage. We also change the numbers to reduce them so that it all.
Okay. Adam? Sue, is there an update on the website?
Update from last week, no, but I'm planning on doing the lightning talk in the last week of April, so it's probably the next update from me.
Okay. Just going to double check that that's perfect. Already written down up top. All right. Then in terms of any other business, we covered this one last week, that slides would typically be shared by the author on whatever site they choose, and or linked to from blog posts. So I think I can remove that. The Artifactory disk space Adam covered in the infrastructure case. So I guess that moves us to the CMake migration. Devin, do you want to?
Yeah. Excuse me. So on the CMake front, we now have all the perf tests run on the platforms we built in the open, and those are all showing no regressions. So I'm starting to move forward with making CMake the default build system. The current plan is to start off with OS X because it has basically because it has the least amount of baggage from heritage, because it's the new build. So currently the plan is to get the builds running on our Jenkins instances and have full tests running there and passing. And then once that is achieved, creating a blog post or something to get the community informed about the changes that are coming there. And then once we're satisfied that everything is good to go, patching the JDK extensions so that on OS X you no longer have to pass dash dash with CMake to have the CMake build, but rather it would just default to that. And as a fallback, I mean, you can still pass dash dash without CMake to fall back to the old UMA builds. And then from there, moving on to the other platforms. But this is still, the plan is still not really set in stone. So I was looking for some feedback on any potential issues there.
Kevin, can you get the link where you've captured some more of the details on this, added?
Yeah, I'm just pulling that up now.
Does anyone have any concerns as we are moving forward with the migration to CMake?
Just to confirm for the build side, it's going to be sort of a hard flip, or are we going to run both builds in parallel?
So run both builds in parallel for some time, especially while we're still making sure all the tests pass and everything is good. And then, I mean, at some point there is going to be a hard switch, yes.
Testing.
Are there any other comments or concerns on this plan? You don't have to voice them all now either. Feel free to put some thought into this and update the issue. And Devin, it might be good to keep this on the agenda, and if you can attend again next week to follow up on any updates people have put into this plan or any further details you've fleshed out.
Yeah, sure.
Are there any other things we should cover today? All right, then, everyone. Thank you. And next one of these calls is next Wednesday, April the 22nd. And we'll have chatted with you before then. Hopefully, we'll see you all on the call then. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.